Okay. You all know this is the Uniqueness Public Forum. I'm the founder and director of the Center for Theology and Science and Dean and Corporate Professor of Theology and Science here at residence at UTU. Our mission is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and science we do through programs of research, teaching, and public service. And an event like this really combines all three elements. It's an honor to have served on Josh's committee, the doctor committee, and so his research, which is phenomenal, will be the subject of tonight's presentation. But it's also a very much a teaching event because I have students in my classes, and all of you are here, as I am, to learn from Josh in a teaching capacity about this crucial question of Imago Dei. It's also, of course, a public service because there are folks here who are new to CTNS. I'm glad you're here. Please introduce yourself to me afterwards. I'm going to say we have two staff here. Kyle Butler is in the back there with his hand up. Great. And Melissa Moritz, who has been with us the longest of anyone working for us 11 years. Melissa, one picture here. And we also have, I'm proud to say, the newest doctoral candidate at GTU, Xavier. Yes, Xavier. I'm very proud of you. You skipped from kindergarten to college. And, that's what happens when you're in CTNS, is by osmosis, is kind of get it. That's a miracle. I'm truly honored to have served on Josh's doctoral committee, doctoral dissertation committee. I think his work is truly outstanding. He just spans so many fields. It's incredibly impressive to work with him, to learn from him, to even feel shy about my inadequacies around the depth of his knowledge in so many different fields. I want to read you the biographical statement, just to give you a sense of it. Joshua Moritz, who, as you know, just recently got his PhD and graduated here, came here to get an MA in philosophical theology at the GTU, and he brings with him a BS in evolutionary biology from Calvin College. But he also brings with him a BA degree in classical languages, in European history, and in Near Eastern archaeology, and did some archaeological work in the day while he was at Calvin College. So here's a man who's got languages, he's got archaeology, all right, he's got biology, and now he has theology, and there are many other areas there. Josh is currently managing editor for our journal, Theology and Science, and just as a key person, great make that journal happen. It's a very complicated and detailed process, and I'm very grateful to Josh for that. He was formerly the managing editor for Dialogue, the outstanding Lutheran journal, which I'm sure many of you take. And he served as a copy editor for a variety of CTNS publications. By the way, many of them are on the back, and they are for sale at a discount price, and the money goes to the public fund. So I encourage you to think about purchasing a copy afterwards. And also, I'm really delighted to say he's editing the book I'm currently researching, and yes, finally finishing, Time and Eternity. Many of you know I've been working on that since before the flood, which is way back. It takes a while to get it right, especially for some. So in any case, with all seriousness aside, it is truly an exciting evening to see, to hear Joshua. There are really three doctoral students here who are working in similar related topics, taking very different views of them, all very exciting. I think it's very appropriate with Josh being the first to actually graduate, to get a chance to share his ideas, to get our feedback. And I see this as the beginning of a wonderful series of ways of bringing his work to the wider academic community and the general public. I think it'll have an amazing impact. And when the book is out, it's going to be like a ripple across the field. So, chosen from among the animals, the end of human uniqueness, and the election of the Imago Dei, and he means every word. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Bob.
I'm just going to talk for about 15 minutes. We'll have Q&A.
As Bob said, tonight I'm going to talk about my dissertation work, and up there you see the title of my work. I wonder if we could get, do we need these lights over the PowerPoint?
No.
No? Kyle, can you turn them off? So you don't see. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
They're okay. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes, and then we'll have a good amount of time for questions and conversation. So I'd ask that everyone hold any questions you might have until the end. Some of your questions might be answered in the next slide, and if not, there'll be plenty of time at the end. So The guiding theological question for my work, chosen from among the animals, is what does it mean for human beings to be created in the image and likeness of God? In both popular opinion and in the minds of many scientists and academics, the idea of human uniqueness and human superiority has been linked to the Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei. Among Christian philosophers and theologians, the connection between the unique nature of humans and the divine likeness has similarly been assumed and even systematically argued for. Pursuing what is called the comparative approach to theological anthropology, these philosophers and theologians have asked, in what ways is human nature different from the nature of animals and therefore like the nature of God? And that's why I have this big crack here. Oops, wrong button. Big crack here between Adam and the animals. It's the question of how is Adam, how are Adam and Eve, how are human beings different from the animals? What makes them different? What behaviors? What capacities? In contrast to these scholars, in my dissertation, I question any concept of the image of God that equates the Imago Dei with some characteristic or capacity which presumably makes humans unique in a non-trivial way from other animals. To do this, I first offer scientific, philosophical, and theological critiques of the notion that humans are unique. Moreover, I demonstrate that the theological understanding of the image of God as based within unique human characteristics has no conceptual monopoly within the Christian theological tradition, that historically this is not the only view that's out there. I then take both a historical and systematic theological approach to address constructively the matter of the Imago Dei. Instead of grounding the image of God or the Imago Dei in human uniqueness, whether biological uniqueness or ontological uniqueness, I argue that the image of God is exegetically and theologically best understood in light of the Hebrew theological framework of historical election. Viewing the Imago Dei as election incorporates the findings of contemporary biblical studies and takes seriously scientific understandings of both evolutionary continuity and the psychosomatic unity of the human person. The understanding of the image of God, which I develop, resolves many long-standing theological dilemmas, such as addressing the central point of contention in the so-called creation-evolution debate. This is especially with regard to the relationship between theological understandings of the image of God and the scientific discovery of human-animal continuity. Furthermore, my argument offers a theological anthropology which entails robust approaches to environmental and animal ethics. But I'm not going to talk about all of that today. A lot of that's in my dissertation. Today I'm going to talk about some key questions that frame my dissertation work. Among them, in this lecture I will cover, what does it mean to be human? What is this thing we call human nature? How is human nature continuous with the nature of other animals? How is it discontinuous? And especially, what does it mean to say that humans are created in the image and likeness of God? But first, a bit on the current cultural context of these questions. Beginning with Lynn White in the mid-1960s, many have asked, what are the religious and or philosophical roots of our current ecological crisis? White argues that a key historical cause of the current ecological crisis is the Judeo-Christian belief that humanity is created in God's image. Christianity, White says, asserts that the human being is not simply part of nature, he is made in God's image, and that God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. More recently, author Daniel Quinn, in his popular novel Ishmael, has reasserted White's thesis. In Ishmael, Quinn's protagonist, who is a sage-like talking gorilla named Ishmael, says, "The people of your culture cling with fanatical tenacity to the specialness of man. They want desperately to perceive a vast gulf between man and the rest of creation. This mythology of human superiority justifies their doing whatever they please with the world." Quinn argues that the practices of environmental degradation that produce animal suffering and global species extinctions arise from an ideology rooted in the axiom The world was made for humans, and humans were made to rule it. So where does this axiom come from? Well, Quinn says, these ideas find their definitive foundations in the biblical story of Genesis, and in particular, the notion of humans as God's image. Consequently, Quinn contends that the individual who earnestly desires to save the world must reverse the story of Genesis and negate the logic of the theological worldview that is at work within. In other words, the one who wants to save the world must oppose what ethicist James Rachels calls the image of God thesis. According to Rachels, the image of God thesis holds that humans are absolutely distinct and discontinuous from animals, and that humans have a separate origin from them. Rachel says that the image of God thesis holds creation was exclusively made for human use and benefit, and that humans are the sole subject of God's love and attention. He also says that the idea of Darwinism or Darwinian evolution undermines and falsifies the image of God thesis. And one finds this idea of the image of God thesis cropping up everywhere. Many philosophers, Peter Singer cites the image of God, and many others are very critical of Christianity and their role in ecology and animal ethics because of this image of God thesis. It's also served as a lens through which people have seen other Christian doctrines, such as the Incarnation. Paul Davies, for example, says that Christianity is the religion most challenged by the concept of extraterrestrial beings, because Christians believe that God became a human being. Jesus Christ is called a Savior precisely because he took on human flesh to save humankind. Davies continues, he did not come to save the whales or the dolphins or the gorillas or the chimpanzees or even the Neanderthals. However noble or deserving those creatures may be or were, Jesus Christ was the Savior of Homo sapiens, specifically one planet and one species. And underlying this is the idea that Christianity says humans are unique, and therefore Jesus came to save this unique species. And then the question is asked, is Christianity a hopelessly anthropocentric faith, if this is the understanding? This idea that human characteristics and behavior are absolutely unique from all other animals in a non-trivial way is what I call homo singularis, meaning humans as unique, special, or singular. The idea of homo singularis leads to various attempts to identify the particular capacities that form the basis of the supposed essential or unique nature of humans. For theologians, then, the Imago Dei is connected to the loci, or the places where humans are distinct, and these places that separate humans from the animals. One finds homo singularis everywhere. You see, whoop, that was the wrong button. For the last time, stop following me in creation. One finds homo singularis everywhere. For instance, young earth creationists argue for this understanding of humans as absolutely distinct from animals. One also finds this in the writings of political conservatives like Ann Coulter. And the reason I mention her is in her New York Times best-selling book, Godless, she spends, I think, almost 200 pages talking about evolution and the idea that humans are unique. Many evangelicals also talk about this idea of humans as absolutely unique. For instance, Rick Warren is one popular evangelical, and his wife Kay have written a bit about how humans are absolutely distinct from animals and how this has implications for salvation. One also finds more progressive thinkers like emergent church thinkers. Rob Bell, for instance, has this understanding of humanity. But these thinkers are not alone. One also finds the idea of homo singularis among many scientific and theological voices. Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist and atheist, has this idea of humans. So does E.O. Wilson, another evolutionary biologist, and George Gaylord Simpson. For theologians and scientists who are theologically inclined, we find that this idea of homo singularis is equated with the image of God. Francisco Ayala makes this move, so does Holmes Ralston, Karl Rahner, Wolfhard Pannenberg, Wenzel van Heijsting, and many others. For example, Richard Dawkins speaks about homo singularis in passages like this. We're built as gene machines and cultured as meme machines, says Dawkins, but we have the power to turn against our creators. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. According to Dawkins, humans, and humans alone, have the ability to change the course of evolution. Humans are absolutely unique in this respect. Holmes Ralston III, quoting George Gaylord Simpson, says, man is an entirely new sort of animal in ways altogether fundamental for understanding his nature. The human species has properties unique to itself among all forms of life. Man's intellectual, social, and spiritual nature are altogether exceptional among animals in degree, but they arose by organic evolution. They usher in a new phase of evolution, and not a new phase merely, but also a new kind. And so here we have a shift from differing in degree to differing in kind. Humans are absolutely unique. Karl Rahner is a theologian who develops this a bit. He argues that it is uniquely in the human being that nature becomes conscious of itself. Rahner says, the history of nature and of spirit form an intrinsic and stratified unity in which the history of nature develops towards man, continues on in him as his history is preserved and surpassed in him, and therefore reaches its own goal with and in the history of man's spirit. Another theologian who develops this in a different angle is Wolfhard Pannenberg. Pannenberg argues that the human disposition towards openness to the world and openness towards God is in distinction from the dependence of animals on their environment. And such behavior, says Pannenberg, gives the human being a special place in the animal world. Unlike animals, human beings are no longer limited by a set of drives and instincts, but rather human life is characterized by freedom and openness to the world. And again, this is in distinction from animals, and Pannenberg other places says this is not just a matter of degree. This is a qualitative difference. This is an in-kind difference. More recently, J. Wenzel van Heijsting in his Gifford lectures argues for the place of human uniqueness and how that relates to our understanding of the image of God. He argues that if we as theologians take science seriously on the issue of human uniqueness, then the notion of the image of God, or the Imago Dei, is finally strikingly revisioned as emerging from nature itself. Van Heijsting explores scientific notions of human distinctiveness in order to ground theological notions of human uniqueness as they mutually inform the doctrine of the Imago Dei. Van Heijsting says, whereas the behavior of non-human animals is held tightly on a genetic leash, for human beings, says Van Heijsting, the leash is broken. Biology and culture are two dramatically different phenomena, even though culture is superimposed on biology. The human species, says Van Heijsting, clearly transcends our biological origins, and our possession of culture makes our species unique in the animal kingdom. So here we have some examples of what certain individuals say make humans unique. Dawkins talks about freedom. Pannenberg talks about openness, or the human lack of innate instinct as opposed to animals. Rahner speaks of self-consciousness. Van Heijsting speaks of culture. Francisco Ayala and Holmes Ralston talk about rationality. And Ayala, who we didn't talk about, also talks about moral behavior as one of those things that distinguish humans from animals. However, one might ask, or we might ask, has science clearly demonstrated that all these characteristics are absolutely unique to humans? I would say no, and so would many others. Big surprise, perhaps, but empirical studies have not clearly shown that non-human animals lack all these characteristics. Rather, those who hold that humans are unique in these areas implicitly appeal to what I have called an anthropocentrism of the gaps. In other words, in lieu of empirical evidence, they fill the empirical and epistemic gaps with an unwarranted faith in human uniqueness or human specialness, where science has not yet demonstrated a clear evolutionary gradualism or a clear discontinuity. And so anthropocentrism of the gaps works a lot like the God of the gaps. We're lacking empirical or scientific evidence. Sometimes we're tempted to put God in the place of that evidence. I'm arguing there's a similar tendency to put human uniqueness where evidence has not gone either way. let me give you a historical example of anthropocentrism of the gaps at work. Thomas Henry Huxley, pictured here below. As you all know, you probably know Huxley. He was Darwin's bulldog, a great advocate of Darwin. In the beginning of 1960, he had a debate with this fellow up here named Sir Richard Owen. Owen was England's leading comparative anatomist at the time and leading paleontologist. And he had argued that humans are unique in their possession of a part of the brain called the hippocampus minor, which at that time, in 1858, had not been discovered in the great apes or in any other non-human animal. Owen blindly appealed to a type of anthropocentrism, or a faith in human uniqueness. Where the gaps were, he appealed to this human uniqueness. And he presumed to fill these unknown empirical gaps with this faith that humans had to be different. Thus, at the end of his paper in 1958, citing the hippocampus minor, Owen says, quote, "Thus man fulfills his destiny as the supreme master of this earth and of the lower creation." End of quote. Huxley, of course, disagreed. Huxley was an evolutionist, had faith in continuity, was highly influenced by Darwin, and thus Huxley, upon reading Owen's paper, started to fanatically dissect brains of different animals, primates and others. Eventually, Huxley, along with others who had faith in evolutionary continuity, discovered the hippocampus minor in other animals. And Owen was proven wrong. But that's how anthropocentrism of the gaps works. So what is the alternative? Well, before we talk about that, let's look at some other examples of, or current examples of anthropocentrism of the gaps. Things like empathy, what is called the fast mapping of words, which is relating novel words to novel context. The creation and use of technology, language, something called linguistic recursion, which is the embedding of sounds within other sounds. Understanding of numbers, theory of mind, or this thing called metacognition, where we attribute or understand intentionality to others. All of these things, all these characteristics have at one time have been thought to be uniquely human. But now, recent empirical evidence is showing these are in fact not human. Many of these are more, or some of these are more debatable than others, but there has been evidence shown, at least in some animals, that all these have existed or do exist in non-humans. So then, what is the alternative to the anthropocentrism of the gaps approach? Well, I would argue that if we were to take evolutionary biology seriously, we're forced to acknowledge the reality of evolutionary continuity. As you well know, Darwin was a fan of evolutionary continuity, but this was not just in the area of comparative anatomy, where it concerned organs like your liver or stomach, and comparing the hearts of animals to humans, but also in the area of mentality. Thus, Darwin argues that the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. So if we take evolutionary biology seriously, we find that the unbroken nature of evolutionary transformations, along with the fact that species evolve gradually, entails that the boundaries of species are vague. The process of the evolutionary transformation of life is characterized by continuity. When viewed from a historical perspective, there are ultimately no absolute or sharp dividing lines between species. So what does this look like? Well, if we think about species as colors in the spectrum, we may think about Dimetrodon here as a sort of purple and Moritz as a sort of red. And they look like very different animals, right? Very sharp lines. You wouldn't confuse two of them. But if we look at Dimetrodon a little closer, actually Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur, as many think, but has a lot of characteristics that make it similar to mammals when you study its skeletal remains and such. But Dimetrodon, which looks a lot like a reptile, Morganucodon, which looks a lot like a mammal, Morganucodon also has many reptilian features. But then we see the transitions between them. But that's not it. Even these transitions, even the transitional forms, are very distinct. They might be closer to one color than the next. The orange might be closer to the red, and the yellow might be closer to the orange, and so forth. But we have to realize that these are still removed from their context in the overall history of life. Thus, if we were to view the entire myriad of species that were not preserved in the fossil record, the transition would resemble something more like the full spectrum of colors as they seamlessly fade into each other instead of 6 basic colors divorced from their context in the wider spectrum. That is one implication of evolutionary continuity. So when we look at human evolution, we may see the early rodents and the lemurs and old world monkeys and say these are very distinct from humans. Again, we have the same issue though. The transitional forms are like separate colors. But if you put them back in the spectrum, it's very hard to see where purple becomes blue and where blue becomes green. Thus, species have fuzzy or vague boundaries, and such vagueness cannot be reconciled with understanding species as having specific essences or as existing as natural kinds. As a result, there is no qualitative feature, morphological, genetic, or behavioral, that can be considered essential for membership in a particular species. What does this mean? Well, according to philosopher of biology David Hall, one consequence of evolutionary theory is that species as such have no essences, where essences are defined as some attribute or set of attributes which make the individual the kind of individual it is. In this way, no species, including Homo sapiens, has an atemporal essence or a generic nature. Insofar as one wishes to identify or define human beings as the biological species, Homo sapiens, he or she is forced to acknowledge that from an evolutionary perspective, there is no such thing as human nature, and no biological essence that's related to being a human being. Thus, in light of evolutionary biology, it is a futile project which attempts to define humanity in a way that excludes other animals on the basis of certain presumably unique human characteristics or traits. This is particularly the case when one considers the evolutionary context surrounding the emergence of the first genetically modern humans. Anatomically modern human beings, upon their initial evolutionary emergence, 150,000 to 200,000 years ago, would soon discover that they were not alone. The earliest Homo sapiens encountered numerous other humanoid beings who were like them in virtually every respect, and yet still unlike them in certain ways. These terrestrial alien beings were the early hominids. There is a high degree of mental and cultural continuity between modern human beings and the extinct non-ancestral hominids who were each at one time the contemporaries of early humans. And here I have several forensic facial reconstructions of individual non-human hominids who were contemporaries with early humans. This is an early human from about 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, known as Cro-Magnon. This is a facial reconstruction from the skull. It gives us some sense of what they might have looked like. Contemporary with this individual would have been these two individuals. These are both Neanderthals, and what we think they might have looked like. And then other individuals, more recent than the Cro-Magnons, who would have lived about 12,000 years ago, would have encountered individuals that look like this. And this is Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbits of Flores, because these individuals stood about 1 meter tall and actually had big feet, strangely enough. But these individuals here are known as Homo erectus, and modern humans, anatomically modern humans and genetic humans, just like us, would have encountered these individuals in Asia. But these are not genetically human. Here we see another diagram showing the relative time scales. And this also includes a hominid called Hominid X as of yet. And the reason there's no skull here is because we know this other hominid that was contemporary with humans From DNA alone, we found a finger bone in Siberia among layers which contained other artifacts. We extracted the DNA and found that this was indeed a hominid, very close to humans, but distinct enough to be a different species. And so this individual is called hominid X. But we know something about this individual from the artifacts that it left behind. So what were these other hominids like? Well, they were all accomplished bearers of culture and technology. They all created and used sophisticated tools, such as scrapers, knives, hand axes, and in some cases, throwing spears. In some cases, the throwing spears were composite tools, where the point of the spear was put on with bitumen, a tar-like substance. And so you have hafted weapons, which were thought to be quite modern inventions, but here we find this in these early hominids. We know that all of them mastered the use of fire and possessed spoken language. And we can get into the details of these later, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. Some of them, we know, constructed shelters with hearths. Some of them built boats, and we know that they were seafarers from where we found their remains, and we know there was no way they could have possibly got there without building boats and having a sort of enough mentality to do long-range navigation. Some of them ritually buried their dead, and some of them created art and jewelry. Here we find a Neanderthal shell that was carved and painted with red ochre, and we see the remains of a Neanderthal necklace with perforations for a string to go through. This stone bracelet here, or half of the stone bracelet that remains, was found in the layers that the hominid X finger bone was found, and so we know that hominid X created jewelry. And here's what many believe is the remains of a Neanderthal flute. From a scientific perspective, then, such culturally and neurologically advanced hominids from outside our direct line of descent must clearly be seen as the empirical equivalents of human beings, since there are no non-metaphysical criteria by which they may be excluded. We could say, well, perhaps they didn't have a soul, but I would argue that's a metaphysical criteria, the idea of a soul. If we're looking purely on the scientific evidence, we cannot distinguish in terms of culture, in terms of language, or all those things we like to say humans have alone. We cannot distinguish these individuals from humans. Of course, this fact has not gone unnoticed by many theologians of nature. Indeed, Gregory Peterson, Celia Dean Drummond, Nancy Howell, David Cunningham, Oliver Putz, and others have rightly criticized the presumption involved in isolating humanity from the rest of animal creation. They have faulted proponents of what I call the Imago Dei as Homo Singularis position for ignoring current scientific research on the animal mind and for skirting the full implications of the culture and behavior of non-human hominids. For example, Gregory Peterson says, research in the cognitive sciences, and particularly in cognitive ethology, which is the study of the animal mind, suggests that we are not unique, as we have claimed, and that many of the cognitive features that we thought made us unique, we in fact share with a wide variety of other creatures. These scholars have rightly judged that a logically consistent application of the comparative approach to theological anthropology entails extending the Imago Dei to non-human hominids and to other animals. If we're going to ask the question, what capacities make humans unique, and those capacities equal the image of God, then anyone who has those capacities must be in the image of God. Thus, to remedy the theological situation in light of science, they had proposed extending the Imago Dei to include the other hominids and at least some non-human animals, depending on whether or not these animals display certain key characteristics that they would use to define the image of God. However, I would argue that there are certain problems with extending the Imago Dei in this way. I like this Vitruvian monkey image. This view of the Imago Dei still defines the divine likeness via reference to particular capacities and characteristics, which I would argue is a problem to define the Imago Dei in this way. It's a problem in terms of biblical scholarship and in terms of other things. But this is what the comparative approach does. So extending the Imago Dei is continuing this problem. Furthermore, biblical exegetes agree that the image and likeness applies to humans alone. Not only that, historically there have been many interpretations of the image of God. In the midst of this hermeneutical diversity, the one thing that all of these historical interpretations share in common is that they reserve the Imago Dei for humans alone. Extending the image of God designation beyond human beings entails a rejection of over 2,000 years of unanimous theological teaching, which has affirmed that humans alone bear the image and likeness of God. Therefore, any doctrine of the Imago Dei that names animals as the divine image dramatically breaks with the historical Christian understanding of what this doctrine means. Consequently, staying within the boundaries of both the exegetical consensus and historical Christianity requires that we may not extend the image of God to non-humans. If we want to stay within the history and respect what exegetes say, then we cannot make this move. So we have some options. We can say, well, let's deny the empirical reality of evolutionary continuity. Let's just ignore evolution and say that humans are unique. Or we can break with millennia of Christian and Jewish theological tradition and what biblical exegetes say and say that the animals and non-humans are in the image of God as well. Or there's another option, and some have taken this road. We can abandon the doctrine of the Imago Dei as a theological lost cause. That this dilemma is too big to pursue this doctrine any further and just move on and look at other things, but let's just forget about the image of God doctrine. I would say there's another option. Embracing the scientific fact, and I would argue the theological confession of radical continuity between humans and animals, and affirming the long-standing Christian tradition regarding the Imago Dei as the exclusive designation of human beings, I propose that the image of God in humans is both exegetically and theologically best understood within the framework of divine election. Now, a few words on divine election. What I do not mean by divine election, because there's a lot of confusion here, what I do not mean is the classical concept of divine election. The classical concept as Pannenberg and others call it. And this is the idea of election as an eternal decree concerning the eschatological destiny of individual human beings. This is the idea of election of individuals for salvation in heaven, right? And here we see a picture of John Calvin, who was a proponent of this understanding of election. This timeless decree, before the creation of the world, is seen as a divine decision in abstraction from the concrete historicity of the divine acts of election as the Bible bears witness to them. The classical concept of election detaches individuals as the objects of election from all relations in society. Furthermore, it restricts the purpose of election to participation in future salvation, in disjunction from any historical function of the elect. And so this is the idea of election that many of us are familiar with. The abstract understanding of election, though, in the classical concept, is very different from what the Bible has to say about the election of Israel, or of special persons like patriarchs or kings, or of Abraham and Sarah, or any other cases in the Hebrew Bible of election. This is not the classical concept. Furthermore, the classical view of election does not correspond to the view of the New Testament authors, and in particular to the Apostle Paul's statements about election. In the Bible, there is no abstract individualism for the purpose of the salvation of the individual as opposed to the historical context. And so this is an argument made by many scholars and theologians, but I would affirm this, that the historical concept of election is very different from the classical concept of election. Sometimes the historical concept is called the biblical idea of election. So what is the historical concept of election? And this is the concept that I'm using in my work. Well, the historical concept of election sees election as a concrete historical act on God's part that forms the starting point and basis of the salvation history of God with God's people. Election, as it's understood historically, relates to a people whom God has chosen in the midst of history for a special purpose. Election in this sense is in relation to the lineage or genealogy of the people. It is not temporally bounded by certain individuals or even by the specific generation that's elected. Rather than election being a matter of exclusivism and particularity, as in the classical view, the historical concept of election has an inclusive and universalistic tendency. And it's an election for the sake of others as opposed to just for individuals. Furthermore, in the historical understanding, the elect ones are accountable to God for the completion of their mission. And if they do not complete the mission, there are consequences. To break God's commandment is to violate the conditions of election and risk judgment and what's called reverse exodus, where the elected one is driven out of the land of promise and into the wilderness. In light of this historical concept of election, I propose that we understand the designation of the first humans as the image and likeness of God within this larger framework of God's historical acts of election. Why do I do this? Well, one reason is because of the many linguistic parallels between the accounts of the image and likeness of God in Genesis and in other places, and the accounts of the election of people in the Hebrew Bible. For instance, we find similar language, like the word lakah, which is often translated take. In 2 Samuel 7:8, speaking of David, we read, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep to be ruler over my people Israel." And this is understood as an election verse. The same word is used in Genesis 2:15. "Then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden," and this is Umberto Casuto's translation, "to serve God and to guard God's commandments." It's literally to serve and guard it. And often that's said in the garden. Some others argue that speaking of the commandment, which immediately follows upon that verse. But either way, we have the word took. We also find the word asa, which is sometimes a word for created or made, also a word for appointed, but we find this in the context of election. In Genesis 5:1, we also find it interestingly right next to a discussion of the likeness of God. We read, "In the day when God created humankind, he made or appointed them as the likeness of God." There are also many structural parallels within Scripture. One is that ancestral lineage is central for both the image and likeness of God, as we read in Genesis 5:3, and in the concept of election. Election is related to the giving of both commandments and the promise of the land. And we see this throughout the Hebrew Bible, and we also see this in Genesis 2:15 through 16. Election is also related to the multiplication of descendants, and that's another key factor between all the election passages and Genesis 1, where it speaks of the image and likeness of God and the blessings that follow. Also, we find in the Hebrew Bible that election is often creation, that the two are equated. An example is that the election of Israel, which occurs dramatically through the historical events of the Exodus, is simultaneously the creation of Israel. And here we find this word yatzar, that as God formed Israel or created Israel, that was Israel's election. The same word is used in Genesis 2 when God forms the human being. Divine election also involves a fulfilling of both a kingly and a priestly function. And we find this in the language of both the election passages throughout the Old Testament and in Genesis. These are just some of the reasons. There's actually many more. But another main part of this is the ancient Near Eastern context. Here we have a statue from a place called Tel Fekheria, and we have a bilingual inscription here in the garment. If you look really closely, you can see some of this, and on the back. And this is in both Assyrian and in Aramaic. This is from the 9th century BC, and this is one of the instances where we have the words likeness and image used in parallel, and both of them refer to the statue as both the image and the likeness. So the exact same words that we find in Genesis 1. And that shows the Near Eastern context and the royal ideology from which these terms arise. The term Selem, which is image, and Demon, which is likeness. The phrase image of God emerges from this common royal ideology, where individual Mesopotamian, Hittite, and Egyptian kings are referred to as the image of specific gods. This is not just in Genesis. We see this all over the place, where a king is referred to as the image of God. However, within the same royal ideology, we find that many kings who are predicated as the image of a specific god are at the same time chosen or elected as the image or king by the god that they image. So this idea of election is always found in parallel with these terms for image and likeness. These are three concepts that always go together: image, likeness, and election. The link between the image and the divine election is particularly pronounced when a certain individual is irregularly called to become king. Some examples of the use of these terms. One is Thutmose IV of Egypt wrote on a stele that as son of Atum, living image, and here we have the phrase image of the All-Lord, sovereign, begotten of Re. He inscribed on a stele that in a certain dream at the foot of the great Sphinx of Giza, he was elected as both king and the image of Re by the sun god Re. In the Hittite kingdom, not just individuals, but whole dynasties are said to image the specific god that elected them. And so this is a more inclusive understanding of image. The Hebrews, however, have the most inclusive understanding of these terms image and likeness. And they democratize this ancient Mediterranean notion of the image of God, and they use it to apply to all humans. The whole human species is understood as the image of God, and the Hebrews are the only people to do this in the ancient world. I argue that simultaneously they are also expanding this concept of divine election that always goes with the image. Thus, I propose that a proper exegetical and theologically parsimonious understanding of the anthropology of Genesis 1 and 2 reveals that the Hebrew Deuteronomic idea of God's historical election of a person or a people, as in the case of Abraham, Noah, or Israel, in fact encompasses humanity as a whole. In this way, Homo sapiens are chosen by God in a concrete historical act to be a species set apart as God's possession for God's purposes. And this idea of set apart is what I call homo sanctus. So what I'm arguing for is humans as the ones chosen or set apart for the sake of God's purposes, as opposed to homo singularis, humans the unique ones. And so I'm making a move here that is very different from classical understandings of the image of God. Thus, when we see humans as homo sanctus rather than homo singularis, human specialness lies in the fact that Homo sapiens are the animal species chosen and called by God to be his servants for the sake of the whole creation. The human species is envisioned as a chosen tribe of animals who is called to embody God's purposes for the other animal tribes and ultimately for the whole of creation. In this way, election is seen as a blessing, and this is the Hebrew understanding of election. Right? Election isn't exclusivistic for the sake of salvation, but it's inclusivistic and universalistic for the sake of a blessing. As the election of Israel neither signaled God's renouncement of the other nations, nor involved their rejection in any way, and those are the words of Horst Kruse, Old Testament scholar, so the election of humans in no way indicates God's rejection or lack of concern for non-human hominids or animals. On the contrary, as Abraham and Sarah are called to be a blessing to all the families of earth, as Israel is called to be a light to the nations and a blessing to the nations, so the commission from God to Adam and Eve is intrinsically connected with this idea of the blessings of God to the rest of creation. This is a representative function where humans are called as representatives of the animals to bring the blessings of God back to these animals. It's not a question of salvation, but a question of blessing. I'll just end it there.
We have time for some questions, and I'll just ask you to recommend Josh.
Questions?
That's a very nice piece of scholarship. Congratulations. As you were going through your talk, for a while I was kind of concerned because one of the other models for Imago Dei is the model of relationship between God and human. And you sort of skip that as you're going along and doing the evolution and everything. But then when you got to the end and you got to the idea of election, it just struck me that in essence, from God's point of view, election occurs at a time when the human species, whatever how you want to define it, has come along strongly enough that the capacity to have a relationship with God is there, and at that point, God chooses. Does that make sense to you as a way of embellishing what you just said?
Yes. I would agree. Insofar as the capacity for relationship is not another characteristic that is the content of the Imago Dei. So I would argue that Neanderthals and Homo erectus and others also would have this capacity for relationship.
Okay.
So why not? Why are they not in the image of God? And that's why I would say it's God's choosing. It's God's election.
Okay.
And I'm making that as an exegetical move primarily, not just to make sense of the scientific data, but it works very well with the scientific data because it's a way where there really was no distinction in any real sense between humans and non-human hominids at one point. 300,000 years ago, Neanderthals and what would eventually become Neanderthals and what would eventually become humans shared a common ancestor. It was only 150,000 years ago that we know humans emerged. How they emerged is a different question, but we know they did emerge. We know that there is this thing called the unity of the human species. We all share this thing called humanity through a historical relationship to those early humans. And this is the point where you could really see election functioning in the same way as it would function with Abraham and Sarah. God saying, I'm calling you to a different land, to a different place. And so if you want to tie this to that data, which you don't have to, it's a question of how you read Scripture, but it certainly lends itself to that understanding.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's go, David.
Maybe this goes a little bit beyond the text to ask this, but I can understand how the Imago Dei may inform us about who we are in the context of this story. Would it be possible that there is also an election of every and any other species on its own terms to be representative of God in the way that can be represented here?
And I think you answered your own question. It's if we're sticking to the text, then we have to deal with the idea that humans are alone in the biblical text, are the image of God. And so, if there were other texts that were out there, say if there were extraterrestrial texts, and their texts say they were elected, I think the more the merrier. I don't think there's any reason to say, well, they couldn't be elected in this sense.
Yeah, and there are ethical implications to this question.
But it's also not a question of, well, if there's extraterrestrials who have all the neat capacities that we as humans have, are they automatically understood to be the image and likeness of God? And that's why moving it to election doesn't have this automatic inclusion factor where you have to go against what the whole historical tradition and what the consensus of biblical exegetics say in terms of humans alone. So that, if does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay, it helps. Okay. So,
I think Mark had a question.
Yes, sounds great, Josh. So I'm wondering, you're talking about election as a historical event.
Yes.
So how do you relate that to the continuity among the hominids?
Yes.
Are you claiming a particular time?
That's a
even
great
if
question. Yeah, that is a great question. That's one of in my dissertation I talk about 9 criteria by sort of the gauntlet that needs to be run to have an idea of the image of God that can deal with the scientific data. And so that's actually one of those criteria. How can we talk about humans as a unique species in light of evolutionary continuity? And the way that we do that, for those of you not familiar with what a biological species is, it's actually a very complex problem because there's this idea of species as a natural inbreeding group. But then when we talk about fossils, we really can't tell if something that's been long extinct is interbreeding. And even today, we have species that are able to interbreed that usually don't. And so this question of, well, what are the lines between species? And so I define that historically in terms of genealogy, which would be what's called the phylogenetic species concept, as opposed to what's called the phonetic. And the phonetic species concept goes back to the like phenotypic appearance. When you look at your broad features, that's not the best image for that. But if you were to look at the skull and the skeleton and say, okay, this has an appearance of species, and that's more of an essentialist way of looking at species. Rather, I'm looking at species as historical relationships. And so at the point upon which something branched off and started becoming a new species is when I define species. And so that has to do with, in biology, something called the founder effect. And so if there's, say, a random species gets swept in the current and goes to an island, and that point at which it's separate from its ancestral group is when technically the species begins as a new species. Though initially they're no different than the other species, there is a point in time which they do become separate. And so we see that in humanity because we do share common ancestors. There's a point at which groups migrate and start to become new species. And so I'm defining that historically or genealogically, which interestingly relates directly to election as a genealogical sort of thing. So it actually ties in quite nicely. Yes.
Well, what about moving it more to more recent times, the election? Julian James and the bicameral mind. So there's something that happened in more recent days that allowed us to be able to interrelate with God in a new way. So it's not just genetic, but something.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of anyone who says that humans 200,000 years ago didn't have all those capacities. We know that they had language. We know that they had many aspects of culture. I guess I wouldn't scientifically see a reason why humans, say at the Cro-Magnon age, 40,000 years ago, where you have very well-developed culture in Europe, are different from humans 80,000 years ago in South Africa, where you have similar well-developed culture. But there's a lot that material evidence also doesn't tell us. And we know that many years before humans even showed up, thousands of years before humans showed up, Neanderthals were doing similar things in terms of culture. So there's every reason to believe that our common ancestors also had capacities. And I'm staying away from any capacity-related approach in general. So I mean, I wouldn't go there. I would have arguments against that we have seen things. But if this is if it's very important to a person that these capacities exist, and they could decide that, because you have to always do that if that was the way you were looking at things. Yes.
Yeah. So you made the reference at the end to God electing Israel among all the nations.
Yes.
Similarly, God elected humans among all the different species.
Yes.
So would you also extend that parallel in a sense, right, with the emergence of Christianity and Jesus Christ? God was extended to all the nations, and all the nations were responsible for carrying out his message, and they could all have salvation. Similarly, would you see that all animals also have a soul and also are capable of salvation in that sense?
Yeah. So there's a couple questions in there. I'll try to deal with the ones I've heard. The idea that animals have a soul, insofar as humans have a soul, I would argue that animals have the same thing. The idea of nefesh, or the language that's used of animals is, I'm trying to think of. So the question of if we look at Scripture, we see that in Ecclesiastes, the destiny of humans and animals are the same. Among many biblical scholars, like John Levinson says, according to ancient Hebrew anthropology, the human being is not an amalgam of the perishable body and the mortal soul, but a psychophysical unity. But we also find that the animals, right, are described in exactly the same terms as humans. So this is something where many biblical scholars are in consensus that humans and animals you use the exact same terms to speak about both of them. So insofar as humans have a soul, you have to give animals a soul. And if humans don't have a soul and there's something else, then animals are the same. So we find this throughout. The other question was with Jesus, where does Jesus fit into this?
Right.
And so what's interesting about Jesus is we read in John, when the Word became flesh, right? And the word starts there, it corresponds to this Hebrew phrase called kol basar, right? This, when you see all flesh, whenever you read, sometimes in the King James, and all flesh will see it together, right? This literally means all living things. And so this term for all flesh in the Hebrew and the flesh, they're the most inclusive term, that's the most inclusive term you can use when you're talking about life, right? And so it's interesting that Jesus, the Word, right, the Word did not become, anthropos, did not become human, did not become aner, did not become man, but it became flesh, right, sarx. So the most inclusive category, which you could translate as it became a living creature. And so I think there's a very consistent understanding of taking on the understanding of Adam as the elected one, and Adam and Eve, and bringing that straight into New Testament Christology, where Jesus now is becoming the new Adam as the one who is taking up that elected mantle and becoming the incarnation, the incarnation of the Word in flesh in order to redeem flesh. So I think there's cosmic significance in that choosing of the term flesh as opposed to anthropos. And I think we get that wrong when we say, well, the Word became man or the Word became human. That's not what it literally says. It's a much more inclusive category.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. Let's go with, I think, yeah.
Thank you for the my question is, didn't you find any other biblical interpretation in which the Imago Dei is applicable to the other animals? If some biblical scholars find that possibility of the interpretation, is maybe your interpretation of election is kind of
I think right now there's pretty much of a consensus, and so I think if there was one scholar that were to make an argument, there's still a huge consensus against that scholar. There's also the whole historical tradition, and even those who extend the idea of the Imago Dei to animals, like Langdon Gilkey and others, are clear to say, it's obvious from the text that this intends to be humans alone, and so they see that as a negative aspect of extending it. So it's not. I would argue that that's probably the least controversial part of it in terms of where the consensus is. But even, say there was some sort of interesting discovery about the ancient context of image and likeness of God, or a different manuscript of Genesis or something like that, the other parallels still stand. So I'm not sure what that would look like in terms of if there was some discovery, but it's. I don't want to create a theory that's unfalsifiable either. It's not. So I'm going to go where the data leads. Other questions, yes?
One of the biblical things that might set humanity apart is not so much vocabulary about humanity, such as nephesh, but vocabulary about God.
Yeah.
And in the first creation account, the verb make is used 5 times, and the verb create is used 5 times. And create being much more powerful. And the Greeks didn't even have a word for create because they never thought of that. In the beautiful window where we're sort of seeing the inner mind of God in the creation process, the verb create is used 3 times in the creation of humanity. So I wonder if God's activity is more defining of us than any set thing about us, and then we have to learn how to engage that in order to really be the image.
No, I think absolutely. In terms of, God's activity is what's involved in election, and election is creation. Right? So in this way, natural selection, if God is doing the selecting and saying, "Hey, I want you to come to a different land," And in that going to a different land, you become a different species. That is the creation. And so there is a human uniqueness in here, but it's not a uniqueness based on capacities. It's a uniqueness based on God's choosing, right? It's not a uniqueness that's based on, say, the ability to speak or rationality or understanding of morality or even knowledge of God's will. And if it was, then if we were to be an absolute literalist, right? If we were to be absolutely literal, or even take a narrative approach to the early chapters of Genesis, and we read about the serpent as the cleverest of the animals, right? The serpent's talking. The serpent has knowledge of God's will. The serpent seems to have knowledge of good and evil, and not to sin, right? How is the serpent not in the image of God if these are the things that we say are the capacities that you need? And so this wouldn't have been lost to centuries, thousands of years of rabbis and others looking at this text. Well, if this is an animal, then they have all these things. How are humans different? So I think what you're saying, it's interesting because there is something different. There's certainly a focus, but not a focus on capacities. It's something different in the creating that doesn't equal a soul or something like that. But something which election would tie into. I'm arguing. Bruce, you had a question.
How does this framework view Adam and Eve and the fall, God's relationship with Adam and Eve? How does it sort of...
How does it work into it?
Yeah.
Well, that's
like it's historical people or is symbolic?
Yeah. You can certainly read it historically. I think I'm being very neutral in that question. So I'm taking what's called a narrative approach to Scripture. That if you want to be an absolute literalist, it makes the case as much as you see it symbolically. For instance, if you want to take the serpent as an actual literal animal that's talking, then it sort of actually makes the case even stronger in that sense. Because then you say, well, who's the serpent? The cleverest of the animals. The serpent is clearly contrary to the will of God. So there's a fall before the fall. There's an animal fall of these rational animals that are pre-human who are resisting God's will. And that's something you don't have to go beyond Genesis to get there. So the question is, well, if humans are entering into a pre-fallen world, what's the purpose of election? Well, from the language of Genesis, we find that, or Genesis 1 and 2, we find that this garden is the same language used for the sanctuary is used of the Garden of Eden. And we find this cosmic sort of priesthood being set up. Priesthood which is, and sort of this sovereign kingship or steward and priests who are given this vocation to do God's will, maybe to start bringing a blessing to a creation that's already fallen. I think you could work within that framework without going out of a literalistic understanding. And if you're going to look at it symbolically, nothing really changes. There's no commitment to a literal two people called Adam and Eve, but there's also no rejection of them in terms of human genealogy goes back to the point that we don't know. We have the genetic information, we have the archaeological information, and we know that everyone in this room, every single person in this room, is more closely related than if you were to take two individual baboons from within a couple square miles of a section of Western Africa and say, okay, let's do their genomes, right? These baboons live a few miles from each other, or less than a mile. If you took the two most diverse humans you could find, they are more closely related than these two baboons. And this is a phenomenal discovery, that humans are so closely related. It shows that we were all part of a very small family at one point, 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. And so there really is this unity of the human race that allows for this idea that, well, boy, at one point we were all one small family. And I think that if you want to think about who was God, if you want to take a more sort of historical approach, if you want to see the text historically, it certainly lends that understanding of the science, certainly allows room to understand it. So I think there's a lot of, you could say, ecumenical potential in sort of understanding the image of God in this way. All right, other question. I'm going to go with Blake and Bob.
Kind of to piggyback a little bit on that last question. So in this new mindset. I mean, I've heard often in terms of the idea of sin.
Yes.
Also falling on the idea of capacity. We have the capability of sinning. In this new framework of election, would that be the case, that it's through election that we're able to sin? As odd as that sounds, it's that moment that comes in.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't claim to be an Augustinian. So the idea of not being able to sin, I would argue much more down the line of Irenaeus, who says that humans were created with a necessary imperfection as children to grow. That's sort of the tack that Irenaeus says. So in terms of capacity to sin, I think the serpent had as much capacity to sin as the early humans, and I think Neanderthals before humans had the capacity to sin. So I would make that argument. I mean, it's an interesting take, but I wouldn't go there.
Josh, terrific presentation, really clear. I like your point about election not being the kind of Calvinist individual destiny, but being election of a tribe or a people, and for service for the rest of the world.
Yes.
My question is, how does that apply and analogously when you say, well, Homo sapien is elected, but the other hominids are gone?
Yes.
So what other species are we serving if we're the only ones around?
Yes. Well, I would argue non-human animals who also have many capacities. Dolphins, chimpanzees. We have New Caledonian crows who make tools. We have gray parrots who have a knowledge of numbers and speaking. I mean, there's many different capacities in conscious beings. We're still called to be a blessing to these other animals out there, and that's why I'd say chosen among the animals, not chosen among the hominids, for instance. It is tragic that these other hominids are gone. We will never see their cultures flourish. We will never be able to be a blessing to them like we were. And who knows, for 60,000 years, we had the opportunity to be a blessing to the Neanderthals in Europe and other places. But the fact that they're gone, and we don't know why they're gone, the fact that they're gone is tragic. But it doesn't undo election in that sense, that we're still, any more than the Hittites not being around or the Assyrians not being around undoes the election of the Jews in that sense. In the back, yes.
Coming back to the question of uniqueness, obviously a crow cannot re-engineer the germline.
Yes.
And a crow cannot destroy the planet, basically, which mankind can. So is there some unique aspect that pertains to humankind, Homo sapiens, because of that fact, that we can actually act like God, whereas the animal kingdom obviously cannot?
Yes. I would say it's not any sort of necessary capacity that is related to something called human nature. And the reason I would say that is because people like the Piraha of the Amazon River Basin, who don't have things like linguistic recursion, who only have a very limited number use. I think if we were going to define humanity by our ability to sequence the genome, then we kick a lot of people out of this concept of humanity. And so whatever we make normative, if that's going to hold, we need to get rid of a lot of people that don't come up to that definition. And so in this way, you look at certain cultures who we might use the word primitive to describe them from our Western sort of technologically advanced perspective. But in other ways, they're very advanced in their own social systems in terms of relationships or other things like that, or music. There's sort of the question: how do we define what's important? And I guess I would stay away from making that distinction too hard. Does that answer your question?
Well, it seems to me that there's a certain uniqueness entered planetary history.
Yes.
When a created entity got to the point, whether through evolution or whatever, got to the point where it could become God. It could have godlike powers and basically reverse creation.
Yes.
So that philosophical or metaphysical question, it seems to me, is a profound one. What is that? How is it? What does it mean? What does it mean?
No, I think that is a very interesting question. I wouldn't relate that to the image of God, though. I wouldn't relate to the image of God. Other questions? Maybe we could have a couple more. How are we doing time-wise? 5 minutes, okay. So a couple more. Let's, right there, yes.
I hope you don't mind if we go back to the primordial soup for a little bit.
That's great, yeah.
30 years ago, when I was doing evolution research down at UC San Diego, I had a wonderful opportunity to be around Harold Urey and Stanley Miller.
Yeah. The
They were
experience.
doing research in our department. So I got to really dwell upon a lot of their very important work, of course, about how life could have started. And I couldn't help dwelling on the notion of word become flesh. And as you know, the whole DNA system, and Harold Urey and Stanley Miller showed how that might have actually started to arise, was basically how nucleotides could develop so that we could have a 4-letter alphabet of DNA. And we think of it in terms of 3 nucleotide words. We actually call them words as they relate to 20 amino acids, right? And it really is a self-replicating information system that started evolution. And so it was the word become flesh. And so I think going back as far there in terms of the primordial soup, and then jumping up to where culture starts. And I actually had up in Alaska, I had a pet crow. And I can tell you that culture starts, it's definitely within a lot of other species. But it does seem that there was a threshold at some point in evolution where originally with the primordial soup we had the word become flesh in the terms of the words of DNA and the evolution of natural selection with a system of information, with words, right? And then we got to a certain circumstance in our evolution way before Homo sapiens, I would agree with you on that, where we started to then have, and I don't denigrate culture in this sense, is that culture was a major quantum shift in evolution, which is a new form of word. It's a new form of information. And then when we do get to Homo sapien, then we do have conscious manipulation of information. And so I don't know how that fits with your notion of election, but those are pretty dramatic from the beginning and the continuity of that.
Yes, I mean certainly we have the emergence in the history of different phenomena, you could say, like that, like culture. But I think to draw a hard, fast line, chimpanzees also have culture to some degree. So do New Caledonian crows, right? We find technology and the evolution of technology, of the different tools they make over generations, and so we find these things, and most animals have not been researched. That's the other thing. Is to say that something doesn't exist among animals is to say it in a total gap of ignorance, because we have not looked at most animals, and not to become romantic about animals, but just to have a sort of cautionary. If we're taking this approach with the gaps, sort of filling the gaps with human uniqueness, we might end up eating humble pie like Sir Richard Owen. And so I think it's wise not to do that. If we're going to really say we're Darwinian, then we need to have our faith in continuity, which is a different approach. But I think these ideas, I think there is a trajectory in evolution that we find. Well, it's interesting because music, in very similar ways, has developed among many species. So has things like the camera eye has developed at least 8 different times in different species that were non-ancestral to each other. And you find all these things, what's called convergence in evolution. And this, if you know the work of Simon Conway Moritz, he's written along with this. Why do these things converge? Why do things like technology and music and consciousness and all these things converge? It seems that, well, maybe there is some sort of, something out there that life can find, but it's not only humans who find it. Even culture, Neanderthals find culture. In some areas, they found it before humans. And so the question of drawing these hard and fast lines, there's sort of 2 types of lines. One is between species, and one is kind of the lines, you could say horizontal lines of things that emerged. There was a point when there was no life, and then there was a point where there was life. And then there was a point where there was multi-celled life, and then there was a point where there was other things. And so the question is, well, where do we draw these lines? And if we're going to try to make humans way up here, the downside of that is we can't have all humans way up there. And so we can't really talk about that as just humans. Right? We can't, cultures who we could say haven't gotten there yet are then excluded from humanity. And it doesn't even work within our own species to sort of draw very hard horizontal lines. I want to go with Adam, and then you could be the final question.
I just want to go
Yes.
back a little bit, because you use this term election
Yes.
from the Hebrew Bible. I just want to press you on, is the consistency across the semantic range really as great as you're proposing? I mean, do you see the same sensibility of the term in the primeval history as in the Deuteronomical history, as in the later prophets? I would be wondering where you would gather resources on that. And I would just follow up to say, most of your scholars, at least from the presentation, were largely Christian Old Testament scholars, which is wonderful.
Yes.
But I wonder if you'd get a different reading from Jewish rabbinics.
Yeah, I've used Jewish rabbinics as well, and
Okay.
I find that there is consistency. I unfortunately didn't have time to get into a lot of the scholarship, but there is a good degree of consistency in Jewish and Christian Old Testament understandings. So I could, so maybe we could talk about this some other time.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, understand a little bit more about the term election.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that it's related to a role, right?
A role.
We are elected for a purpose
Yes.
to do something, so it's for a role. So how is that different from, like, say, stewardship, which is one of the traditional understandings of the image of God?
So the functional understanding. Right. Yes, what we call the functional understanding of the image of God would say that it's the function we play as the image of God that makes us the image of God. So they're related. They're not completely divorced. For instance, with the idea of the very term image, there's this idea of kingship that's involved in the very use of the term. And there's also, in the Genesis text, from the language used, this idea of being a sort of having a priestly function as well. And so a lot of Old Testament scholars would say, well, the function of the image of God is to be a sort of king and a priest. But they would say that, but that's not the content of the actual image of God, just the result. But the question is, well, what is the actual content? That's where I would be saying election is the content. And so it's separate but related. It's the choosing of God in a sort of, not because of anything humans did, or not because of anything humans had. Of course, humans wouldn't be able to play those roles if they didn't have certain prerequisites, you could say, to be elected. But there are also things that Neanderthals would have had just as well. And other creatures would have also had these, you could say, prerequisites. Like, you need to have self-consciousness in order to function as a priest, or understanding of language in order to fulfill another function. And so I would argue that the essence, and I would argue this, again, exegetically through the parallels as well, and the Near Eastern context, that this makes sense in terms of kingship and the priesthood of the elected, of people who were elected, that kingship and priesthood is a natural corollary to the concept of election. And so the functions that are given by biblical scholars fit right onto this schema of election. And so that's sort of where I would make the difference. Again, not that capacities are completely unimportant, because these might serve as certain prerequisites of why, what someone needs to be elected, but they're not the content of the Imago Dei itself. I mean, at least that's what I would argue.
So please join me in thanking Josh for his help. Josh is the managing editor of the journal, which you'll get if you join CTNS, and Kyle can help you join on your way out. Thanks so much for coming.